Okay, so this is my grandma, um, and I'm going to be asking her a couple questions regarding her history. So, first, what is your name, birthday, and birthplace?
Ah, my name is Martha. Used to be, my maiden name was Hollis, and my name now is Martha Davis, and I'm married to Herb Davis. And I was born in 1938 in a city called Chernovitz. At the time, it was Chernovitz, Romania. It used to be part of the Austrian Hungarian Empire. And that's why my parents and I and my family at that time, we all speak German. And I still speak German when I have a chance. And I grew up in a semi religious home. We practiced our holidays. We went to a beautiful, beautiful temple in Chernovitz. Chernovitz, incidentally, had about 47% Jewish people and a very sophisticated town. We called it was actually a city, we called it the Little Vienna because it was modeled after Vienna. And we had universities, we had a beautiful temple, as I said, we had orphanages, we had music, theater, opera, concerts. It was just a beautiful, beautiful city. And when I was born in 1938, I was named after my grandfather, Kalman, who was a judge. Where he came from, he was going to be a rabbi, a Vizhnitzer rabbi. It's called Vizhnitz. A huge rabbinic dynasty came from that city. And my grandfather, Kalman, was going to, be a rabbi, but he decided not to. He became an attorney, and also then he became a judge in the city. And my grandparents stayed in Vizhnitz, but sent all their children to Vienna for education. They finished high school and what was considered in those days college as well. And on my mother's side, my father had two sisters and a brother, a very, very musical family. My grandmother had a beautiful voice, and my two aunts played the piano. One was actually a concert pianist, and my uncle played the violin, and my dad played the violin. And they used to have some beautiful, wonderful parties. A lot of guests were invited, and my grandmother would sing, and they would play usually classical music or other kinds of music. And my dad decided, he was educated in Vienna also, and then after the war he decided to leave his family in Vizhnitz and move to Chernovitz because it was a large city and he had a lot more opportunities there. My mother's family, my mother had an older brother and an older sister, and they were all born in Chortkov, which was a little town in Poland. At the time, it was Poland. It began as Austro-Hungarian city, and again, that's why we all spoke German. My father was conscripted into the Polish army for 2 years, and he was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism even in the army, and they used to literally beat the Jews, the Jewish servicemen. My father got out of that because he used to play the violin for him, so he was spared a lot. And then all of a sudden they started beating him too. So he called his mother, and being a Jewish mother, she got on the train and went to the army place and spoke to the guy in charge and told him what her son had told, and the beating stopped. So that was a good idea for her.
Wow.
And then my father, then he moved to Chernovitz, and he was trained as an electrician. He worked in Chernovitz. He got a very good job as being the head of the Chernovitz, head of the Chernovitz electrical works that controlled the entire city. And my mother, who was born in Poland, she also went to Vienna to study, and she graduated as a high school and college, and she lived with an aunt. And I remember her telling me that her she wore borrowed things from the family, from the aunt's children, and the shoes were too tight, but she didn't want to complain because they were so nice to her. And my mother she was very beautiful. She had a lot of suitors, and she and her girlfriends would go into the main gardens there, and there was dancing. They would dance the waltz, and my daughter and I, when we were in Europe, we actually walked the same path that my mother would have walked to it was called the Cour Salon, and we had dinner there, and we watched them dance the waltz, and it was very beautiful. And then my mother returned to her city, and they came to Czernowitz, and my whole family ended up in Czernowitz, and my mother met my father, and they were married in 1930, and my mother worked in an orphanage, and she also worked for ORT, O-R-T, a training organization, and she taught mathematics, and she taught sewing and designing clothes. And then I was born in 1938, and we led a pretty nice life. They had a lot of friends, and but only Jewish friends. They didn't mix in homes. They mixed outside, at theater, etc., but not in homes. They didn't mix. I didn't know any non-Jewish children. I didn't play with any of them. And
what is your earliest memory from your childhood?
well, when the war was over, I was only 7, so I was very young. I remember the parties we had at our house, and then when the Nazis marched in, first the Poles took control of our city and the northern part of Romania, which really was separate from the rest of Romania, and and we had a lot of parties. And when the Germans came, when the Nazis came, there were so many restrictions. My mother couldn't teach anymore because they did not allow ORT to exist. And my father continued at the electrical works, which was very, very good for us. And I remember hiding in cellars, in fact, in cellars, and where everything was stone, and we were hiding from the Nazis so they wouldn't take us and put us on trains and send us to concentration camps. And as I said, I had the measles in one of those cellars, and 2 of the people in the cellar were a doctor team, a wife and husband, and they had some medication with them. So that was very lucky. And then we'd go back to our apartment. And then the Nazis gave all these restrictions to the Jews. We couldn't go to the theater, we couldn't be out after a certain hour. We couldn't go food shopping until after 10:30 because the non-Jewish people got to pick their food first, and then the Jews were allowed to come. And I remember my mother taking me sometimes to swap meets to sell some of our things so we would have money. And my mother loving math so much, I was just a little girl, and she would do the timetables with me. And I've always loved math because of that. And then finally we got an order that all the Jews, all 47,000 Jews, were ordered to walk to the river, and they would take us across the river. That first they into a ghetto. First they had all of us walk to the ghetto. And I remember that very well. I was very little. I remember my mother and father on either side of me holding my hand. And all the Jews, 47,000 Jews at 6 a.m, marched in the middle of the streets. They marched to the ghetto. and the people on the sidewalks would, yell at us, "It's about time you Jews got out of here," and they would throw tomatoes at us and eggs at us. And some of those people were friends. My parents met them in social situations outside the home, and they sent us to a ghetto and squeezed all 47,000 of us into very small quarters. Babies would sleep in drawers, and we would sleep side by side, almost like sardines. My mother used to hold me and sing to me, and the outside was terrible, so crowded, a lot of disease, a lot of people dying and just lying on the streets for days until they could be picked up. So, but the good thing that happened that saved our life, actually, the mayor of Chernovitz happened to like Jewish people, and he ordered the Nazi regime to release 2,000 Jews. He made a list of people that he wanted to come, that he chose, and these were he said, we have to have these people to run our city. They were half the population, and we can't run our city without them. So there was a list made of 2,000 people, and my father, who was needed at the electrical works, was one of them, and their families. Whenever they had somebody come, they always had their families with them. The Nazis did not separate the families because this way they knew that the people would not revolt or do anything that could harm their immediate family. So we moved back to our apartment, and my aunt and uncle moved back, and my grandparents came with us, and we lived there during the occupation of the Nazis. My father was at work every day. My mother would go to the orphanage and help and teach math, and she would take me with her. So when I was a very little girl, I grew up with the orphans, and that was fun. And then my mother and I were at home once, and my dad was at work, and about 6 Nazis came in with rifles, and they had all the men who were in the apartment building stand outside in the courtyard. They lined them up. They made the adult women and children all stand on the banister upstairs, and they shot all the men right in front of us. This was something that I still have in my memory. It's called a snapshot memory, just as if somebody was taking a snapshot of those 10 minutes or whatever it took. And from the ghetto, they would take people and take them down to the trains and send them to Poland, where there were extermination camps. And we were in our apartment, but once a couple of Germans came, and they wanted to take us away, and I started screaming and crying, and my mother was crying. Even though we had the permits to stay in the city, they were going to take us anyway, and because I was screaming so hard, so they said, "Oh, come on, let's just take whatever we want here, and let's leave." And then they would go on certain streets and clean out apartments or things that had Jews in it. So we would go on other streets, and we would shelter in other apartments where they hadn't hit yet, or where they had already been. And we survived. We survived the war, and then the Russians invaded and drove the Germans out. The Russians from the east. It's very, very well written. It's written about in the history books when the Russians came from the East Coast and drove all the Nazis out. And then we lived under the Russians for a while, which was almost as horrible as living under the Nazis. It was terrible living under the Russians. They would come and just confiscate apartments, anything they wanted. They would take women and put them on trucks with a big sign, prostitutes for the soldiers' use. And everybody had to have a job. If you didn't have a job, you were put on one of those trucks, and the men would be taken to across the river to a place called Transnistrian, where they had a whole bunch of camps. It was holding camps until they took them. The men were working in quarries and different places, and then they would just come and take them to the trains to be transported. And then we were under the Russians. My father was called to the police department and was told that every Friday at 10 in the morning you are going to come here and you're going to tell us about your neighbors, you're going to tell us about your family, you're going to tell us everything that you saw. Every Friday you're going to come and tell us. And my parents decided at that point that they were going to escape. They were not going to stay and do that.
So in the 1950s, you traveled to a displaced person camp?
No, it was 1946 when the war was over. And we traveled, so we left on a train, a cattle train, and I remember that very well. My dad would lift me up, and there was a little window on top so I could look out. And it took us almost a year to get through Poland, through Czechoslovakia, into Vienna, and we were very lucky to have been admitted to the American sector of Vienna. There were 4 sectors, and while we were there, we were in the Rothschild Hospital for a while until we got our strength back, and then we found my aunt and uncle, who were already in the United States, found out that we had survived, and they sponsored us. And so we were in the DP camp for 4 years waiting for our quota to come up. And then I remember going, when I was a little girl, I remember going to the Frankfurt Zoo, which was a very, very beautiful zoo, but most of the animals had been killed in the war. And then we traveled to the coast where the ships would take us to America. And we were there for about 6 months. We had we were taken care of by UNRWA, Jewish organizations from different parts of the world, and we stayed there for about 6 months, and then we got onto the ship. It was an army ship called the USS Black, and we came to America. And at that point, I was 10 years old.
What was your first impression of America, coming at 10 years old, not speaking any English?
Spoke no English. My mother spoke 6 languages, but English wasn't one of them. We had to go through Ellis Island, where the State Department interrogated all of us, and we all had medical exams, as did we before we left. We were interrogated and medical, because they didn't want sick people to come into the United States and start a lot of epidemics. And so we were there for about 1 or 2 days at Ellis Island. We all sat on our suitcases, and then we were allowed to come onto the land of the United States. And my father's uncle was there, and they took us we were with them for 2 days, and then we got on a train to go to Portland, Oregon.
So the 1950s was the McCarthyism movement.
Yes.
How did you and your family or your parents react to that movement?
I was too young. I was too young. I don't remember really, but it was terrible. It was terrible to have people blacklisted, losing their jobs, etc. It was a very, very terrible time, and we would listen to the radio and then TV, what was happening. That was the McCarthy era.
Okay, so after Ellis Island, you moved to Portland, and then at what point did you move to Los Angeles?
Well, I lived in Portland until I graduated high school, and then I was accepted to Berkeley, so I moved down to California in a pre-nursing program. It was 2 years pre-nursing at Berkeley, and 3 years at a nursing school, and I was accepted to Stanford Nursing School, and I went to school there. I ended up not becoming a nurse because I didn't like it. I wanted to become a doctor. So I moved down to Los Angeles with my two friends, and I was going to continue the classes for medicine, and I met my husband, Herb, and we were married, and I became pregnant with my first child on our honeymoon. So there went medical school.
So the 1960s was all of the civil rights movements. What was the extent of your involvement in the civil rights protests of the 60s?
We were not directly involved, but we were financially, we helped in our synagogue and other places, and we were not really that involved, but we were always on the side of the African Americans, or the blacks as they were called in those days, because we felt their pain. We went through a lot of these things. We also had to sit in back of the bus if we were even allowed on the bus. So that was a very trying time, and thank goodness it ended up well.
So, as a Holocaust survivor, what was your biggest challenge raising your children Jewish in Los Angeles?
Los Angeles. It was not a challenge at all, because in those days, even here, Jewish people pretty much stayed together, but we all had friends who were non-Jewish. It wasn't like in Chernovitz. We all had a lot of friends, and we belonged to a temple, and we celebrated the holidays, and my grandchildren were born bat mitzvahed, and it was an easy road. They just went along with everything, and it was not a problem in those days.
Did you ever learn what happened to the rest of your family?
I did. My mother's parents, while we were still there, were actually, they lived on a ranch, and they had a lot of people living there, a lot of renters. And my grandmother, every Friday before Shabbat, she would bake a lot of stuff and make chicken soup, etc. And all these people that lived on the properties, the non-Jewish workers, they would come to my grandmother and grandfather's house, and she would give them food. And unfortunately, those were the people who broke into my grandparents' house and killed them.
How have you chose to share your story?
Well, I've spoken at several places for my grandchildren when they studied the Holocaust. I've spoken at temples, and then I wrote my book. And I did not publish it. I just wanted to have it for my children and grandchildren and posterity to know what happened during that horrible period of time.
Have you returned to your hometown since the war?
No.
Do you
Never
plan on it?
returned. No, I have no interest in returning there. My city is in the Ukraine now, and I could. But my father's family moved down into Romania, into the main city, into the capital, and my father used to go every couple of years and visit them and, bring them money. They were under the Russian rule. They were under communism. And my uncle was an attorney, and he and Rabbi Weiss of Bucharest, where they lived, they would do the work, the paperwork for Jewish people who wanted to go to Palestine and then Israel.
And then, what is something that most people don't know about the Holocaust that you want to share?
Oh, let me think. Well, as I've read, the Jewish people have always stuck together, but in their religion. But it was ultimately their religion that caused them to die during the Holocaust. There were many, many, many camps. A lot of people survived, and in writing my book, I did a lot of research on people who survived the extermination camps, and they were all successful. Not necessarily forgiving, but accepting of people who had gone through, the non-Jewish people who had gone through the Holocaust, as did I. I was in Germany recently, and I saw these beautiful, children and grandchildren of the Nazis, and I think they realized what happened. They realized what they did. They had a lot of museums in Berlin, beautiful city, and I think Jews are very forgiving. They're very forgiving. We talk about it. We don't want to repeat it, never again. But that's why so many Jews marched with King, and so many Jews have fought for the African Americans and the Latinos, because our heart, our soul remembers.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Very well.